do that anyway. Have a seat in the front row. Started? Lost one already. Okay. Oh, one more. All right, should I get started? Okay. Great. Well, hello, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you guys are enjoying the afternoon and the conference. This is my second Drupal event ever. I hope there will be many more. I'm having a great time. Thank you for coming to this talk. We will this afternoon be talking about AMP and progressive web apps, the what, why, and how. As advertised, this will be a high-level but jam-packed overview of these technologies, why publishers and developers are using them, and then a little bit of the how. So I'm going to a little over-index on the what and why because I think the understanding and motivation and vision to build with these products is really the first step. And in terms of the how, there is abundant information online and technical resources that will help you, and I'll make sure that I point those out. So no code on the screen, but a lot of visuals as we go through this talk. So to start out with an introduction, I'm Barb Palser. I'm on Google's Global Product Partnerships team. My focus broadly is web performance, modern web technologies, and best practices. And then within that broad scope, I'm specifically focused on CMS ecosystems. And that's been really a role on my team that's only existed for about 9 or 10 months. And so I'm deep into it, and we really are actually expanding our work and engagement with CMS platforms broadly. So that sort of brings me to the first big why I'm here and why a couple of my other colleagues from Google are here today. First of all, from Google's perspective, we believe that the health of the open web is vital for a million reasons, which hopefully I'll get to talk about a little bit on tomorrow's panel. But within that, we know that well over half of websites are built on a CMS, and that number is growing by double-digit percentages every year. And Drupal, being one of those scaled CMS platforms, has the ability to impact web performance at scale. When I say impacting web performance, maybe saving the open web is a little bit dramatic. I don't know. We'll talk about that a little bit tomorrow morning. But a minimum, I hope that we can all agree that at a broad level, the web really needs an upgrade. This is a pretty clear visual representation of the problem. As you can see, the size, the weight of both desktop and mobile experience has done nothing but grow up and up month after month, year after year. And if you are on a 4G connection, maybe it's not too bad, a little slow. If you are on a 3G connection, it can be extremely painful to almost unusable. And this trajectory is not one that we see stopping or slowing down unless collectively we can start to change the way that the web works and is built. So that is an opportunity for me to plug my colleague, Rick Viscomi, who's in the back corner, who will be doing a talk later today on the state of Drupal performance. He is going to take a look at how Drupal overall performs against the overall web and also other CMS platforms, and get a little bit into some diagnostics into where he sees opportunities for improvement. So don't miss it. Okay, so back to my talk. This is another way of looking at the problem or at the opportunity, which is that historically the web has underperformed in engagement relative to its reach, right? So the web is like the wide mouth of the consumer funnel, very broad, but also tends to typically be very shallow in terms of engagement compared to, say, a native owned app, like a publisher branded app or social apps. Which may not have quite the same level of reach that the web does, but tend to be highly engaging and sticky. We don't think that this has to be the case. There is a vision, and it's not just our vision, it's a pretty broad vision for the idea of what I'll call for this talk the new web, which means preserving the reach and discovery that happens on the open web, but building into it user experience and engagement features that make it as performant and as delightful to use as a native app. So the apps have really been setting the bar, and the web needs to catch up. Specifically, some characteristics of the new web might be, light, fast, smooth page load, highly engaging and sticky, frictionless user experience, advertising and monetization that is effective and optimized but also respectful, and a web that is accessible to all creators, meaning that you don't need to necessarily be a skilled developer to set up and maintain a performance site. So, at this point, I think a lot of developers would look at this list and say, I can build that on my own with the technologies and tools that I have today, and that may be true. And that's part of the beauty of the open web, is that you are free to build your site however you want. And we absolutely, want you to do that. However, if you go back to that HTTP archive graph and all the other data we have, the reality is that isn't happening at scale for whatever reason. And I think there are a lot audio? Oh, there we go. A lot of different reasons across organizations. It may be organizational priority. It may be time and ability to focus. It may just be maintenance and accretion over time. But for whatever reason, websites are getting worse and worse, not better and better. And so for that reason, we think that some well-lit paths are not a bad idea. And so by well-lit paths, we mean templates and frameworks that are developed with the purpose of making it easier to build both rich and highly performant experiences. And 2 examples of that concept are AMP and progressive web apps. So the interesting thing about AMP and PWA is that they both started and evolved at around the same time, but initially independently of each other. So AMP looked at the performance challenge from a lens of speed and embeddability. So lightning fast pages, really smooth load without the content shifting and jumping and stuttering that you see on a typical web page. Pages that are embeddable or portable, which I'll explain what I mean by that in a couple minutes. Whereas PWA kind of came at the challenge from an orientation focused around engagement and reliability. So those are those app-like features, offline availability, adding to a bookmark to your device home screen, and web push notifications. So those are the 2 technologies I'll be talking about. Again, a few more things that they have in common. Both launched and ramped up around the same time, both attempting to solve this challenge of improving the web user experience for both developers and consumers. Both are open web technologies, not proprietary. They are built for the open web, not for walled gardens. Both started with mobile and are now increasingly expanding to desktop experiences. And both have broad ecosystem support, which is absolutely vital for the success of either framework. And so when I talk about ecosystem support, that means actually a lot of things, but at a very high level, it means that in the case of AMP, top global platforms are distributing AMP. And when I say distributing AMP, I mean that these platforms are linking to the AMP version of content when it is available as their default or preferred format, because they are seeing, and it's not just Google, they are seeing that when they do that, when they link to AMP pages as opposed to standard pages, they're seeing double-digit improvements in consumer engagement. And so we have, Google certainly, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest. There's a lot more, Bing, Reddit, eBay, a lot of the top global search, social, and e-commerce platforms are now linking to AMP when AMP content is available. Then in terms of browser support, really for both formats, top browsers support AMP, and they have for some time. And now, most of the top browsers also support service workers, which are a key component of progressive web apps. Point being, you develop on these technologies, they should be broadly accessible and usable and surfaced in a lot of places. Okay, so again, kind of given that the 2 sort of evolved in parallel, but not exactly contemplating one another. There have been, it's common for folks to ask, which should I use? Should I use AMP, or should I use PWA, or should I use both? And the answer is yes, any and all of the above. It really depends on your web property and your use case, what you're trying to accomplish. So I will shift now, and I will do a little bit deep dive in AMP, and then I will talk about PWA, and then I will talk about how websites are combining the 2. So starting out with the AMP project, I think the origin story of AMP is really important, and it's not often told. AMP came about as part of a collaborative effort between a group of European news publishers and Google, who together agreed that the web needs that upgrade. In other words, the web was falling farther and farther behind the high bar set by native apps and walled gardens, meaning that it was more and more challenging to have a viable web presence and web business. And again, considering the fact that the web wasn't self-correcting, the idea was, let's come up with a bold idea to address this challenge and at least show what this vision of a performance web can be, performant web can be. So in the 2.5 years since AMP has been live on the web, it has made great progress in terms of its features and capabilities. That's why hopefully you guys are here, as I'll really bring you up to speed on the progress it's made. There also has been a lot of confusion about what it is, why it is, how it works. Some of that I think Google has been open about, maybe a little self-inflicted just in terms of messaging. And I think some of it is probably a function of the fact that it has evolved so rapidly, it is very hard to keep up. So the way that I'm going to talk about AMP is actually to sort of kind of hold up a lot of the myths and misconceptions as a framework and a way to addressing the realities. Before I do that, quick overview. So what AMP is: open source standard, fast embeddable pages. It's now used by over 56 million domains globally and growing. AMP consists of 3 components. So there's AMP HTML, which is just HTML, extended with custom elements, which are called AMP HTML components or AMP components, which make common web engagement patterns easy to implement in a performant way. Secondly, the AMP JavaScript library optimizes performance, manages resource loading, and supports those AMP components. No external JavaScript in AMP at this point. And then the AMP cache, which is a very fast global CDN with a built-in validation system, which confirms and verifies that when an AMP page is delivered, it's a valid AMP page, it works the way it's supposed to, it's secure, and it doesn't depend on external resources. So those are the building blocks of AMP. AMPproject.org will give you, it's anything you could imagine in terms of understanding more about how AMP is built and behaves. So we'll kind of go to the myth versus reality structure of talking about what AMP is. One of the most common myths, and again, if the last time you looked at AMP was maybe a year or 2 ago, I wouldn't blame you for having this understanding, is that it's a stripped down version of a web page or that it's only for news publishers. In reality, feature and design parity are absolutely possible and being achieved for many sites. Many or most, not all. We're also really open about the fact that AMP doesn't necessarily support every capability and functionality that you need, although there is a really fast evolving roadmap, so we're getting closer and closer to being able to support any use case. AMP is increasingly used by e-commerce sites. In fact, that's where a lot of the AMP project's focus and roadmap has been over the past year or so, and already supporting a lot of rich sites and content verticals like recipes, travel, and so forth. So this is what AMP looks like today. Highly performant, rich, engaging content and commerce experiences that can be indistinguishable from a standard site, except that they load a lot faster. So again, to keep up, ampproject.org, this is the AMP project roadmap. It's really accessible, really easy to use and consume, publicly available, a great way to track what's going on with AMP, and of course, ampproject.org is a great starting point if you want to contribute. Next myth, that publishers somehow aren't getting the same credit for an AMP page when it's displayed from the Google cache, so the AMP project cache, or that AMP cache URLs are somehow by design and part of Google's plan. Neither one of those are true. So in terms of the first, pages that are delivered from the AMP cache are delivered fully intact. That means everything works the same way it would work delivered from your domain. The ads work, the analytics work. It is a self-contained package that is just being delivered from a different cache. This is kind of like what the portability, embeddability thing is about. And then with regard to those AMP URLs, they are a side effect of that AMP cache. So the fact that we do want to make sure that the AMPs that we're delivering to consumers are valid and performant and do what they're supposed to do and deliver them quickly means we use the AMP cache, which means you get those complicated URLs. That is not the desired state, and we announced earlier this year a project underway to use web packaging, which would allow a publisher to securely sign their AMP page, which would then allow that AMP page to be delivered from the AMP cache with the publisher's URL. We're investing a lot of time and work into this project. There are some live proof of concepts already. Don't know quite yet when it will be broadly available, but this is actually one of the most important things to the AMP project because we know that it is a source of concern to publishers and can be confusing to some consumers, so we get it and are working on it. Next myth, AMP is just for mobile, or that it's paired. It's always an ancillary format that sits aside a standard web page. Also not true, AMP works on desktop. You can make a beautifully responsive desktop to mobile AMP experience. More sites are doing that. More sites are also moving to what we often call canonical AMP, meaning there's just one version of a page, and that's the AMP page. We also may call it AMP first, meaning when you can build with AMP, you do. So it's very common to say a hybrid site that maybe uses AMP for its article or leaf pages, and then just has a standard site or page for its, say, homepage or section fronts. So again, this is happening more and more. Here's an example. There are a lot more examples. We're seeing continually more sites move to this approach. As the roadmap evolves and AMP becomes capable of supporting what the site needs, it's frankly, and I think we all agree, just easier to maintain one set of code. So the purpose of AMP was never to have, everyone have to maintain 2 sets of code just to get, for their surfacing and search. It was really sort of, can we get here? This is the goal. This is the goal for everyone, ideally, at least as a capability. So if you want to get inspired and see more examples of what AMP can do, AMP Start is a great resource. It's on the AMP project site. AMP doesn't monetize as well as standard pages. This has been sort of one of the most pernicious and challenging assumptions around AMP. The reality is, and we do a lot of sort of detailed analysis of publishers who say that they are finding AMP monetization is challenging, and what we often find is that the AMP page, that the ad ops on the AMP page aren't implemented at parity with the standard site, meaning the ad density is different, the ad products that they're using are different, they may not be using all their demand sources on the AMP page. And again, it's understandable, because if AMP is treated as an ancillary format, then it kind of gets ancillary attention. And so it's very common for a publisher to set up ad ops on their AMP page and then kind of forget about it for 6 months. Meanwhile, their standard site is evolving, and that's kind of how we see AMP fall behind in parity, and then it's no wonder that it doesn't monetize at the same rate. So the reality is there's over 150 ad tech companies, like programmatic ad networks, ad products, that are supporting AMP or have AMP components. Relatively recently, fast fetch on AMP, so that the ads are called before the page loads. You avoid that initial problem with AMP where the page is so fast that the ads appear slow, as well as HTML ads, which actually load instantly in line with the content. Real-time config for parallel callouts, version of header bidding, and AMP is inherently more viewable because it prohibits the loading of ads that are so far down on a page that the user will never see them. So we consistently see in programmatic that AMP ads outperform standard ads because of this enforced viewability. So some of the ad formats that are supported on AMP, just some examples. Flying Carpet is one that was sort of specific and unique to AMP, but again, a growing library of ad products that are supported. And then I think this is the last big myth, that the point of AMP is Google search traffic. And if you will notice through this whole 20 minutes that I've been talking about AMP, I have not mentioned the top stories carousel, because that isn't the point. It is definitely icing on the cake, and it's also a really good representation of what an AMP, what you can build, the types of experiences you can build with AMP. But the reality is, first of all, in Google search, search looks at speed, whether the page is AMP or not. AMP, we hope, as I said, is used by more publishers as a framework for building websites and pages, so that all users get that fast performant experience. And there are some new use cases coming to the fore, so I want to talk about a couple of those that have, again, nothing to do with search. So one is AMP for email that was announced earlier this year. It's email sent, or an AMP doc sent as email. What that means is the email itself is dynamic and interactive. So if you're sending content newsletters, for example, the content is going to be fresh when the user looks at it, not when you sent it. Or if you wish to have interactive experiences where the user can actually engage with the email, instead of clicking out of it to a website, they can do that, as you see in this example. So I'm expecting there's some companies that are doing some really interesting stuff with AMP for email, and so you should see more about that soon. And then lastly, AMP Stories. You may have heard about AMP Stories. It is a visual storytelling format for the open web. Again, works on desktop and mobile, supports ads, open to anyone can build on it, creates a really unique experience that, again, is discoverable and displayable and embeddable on the open web. The Washington Post does a really good job with AMP Stories. If you want to see an example of what AMP Stories are, you can use your, probably the best way to get there is use your mobile phone or emulator and just search for Washington Post, and you'll get probably a carousel in search results of some Washington Post AMP stories. So really cool, really exciting. We hope to see more publishers contributing to and building these types of products. Okay. Um, audio, there we go. Progressive web apps. So, on the other side of the world. Meanwhile, progressive web apps are also a response to a challenge or a need, which is that while native amps, as you know, are extremely performant and engaging, unless you are like the #1 or maybe #2 or #3 app on a user's phone, you're actually not getting much attention, and users are very rarely downloading new apps. So how can we bring that type of engagement to the web where you have broader surfacing and discoverability? So that's really what PWA was about. It's not really like a framework. It's more of a set of features that are designed to make web apps engaging and reliable. They can launch seamlessly from any web page, including an AMP page. PWA has two main components. So #1 is service workers. So that's a script in the browser running in the background that allows you to tell the browser to do things with a page like background syncing, caching, offline availability, and push notifications. And then the second component being the web app manifest, which is basically the file that will enable the install on home screen capability for PWAs. So PWAs are growing like crazy in terms of usage, and I think that's because the results are just so consistently clear. So here are some of the large brands that are building with PWA. There are many, many more. To talk about a couple of case studies, there are just two I really like. The first one is Pinterest. You can find this case study on Medium. One of the things I liked about it is that they were brutally honest about like current state and why they changed their mobile website to a PWA. It's certainly, you can look at the data, but you can also look at and get a visceral feel for how users are beginning to associate with your brand when you have that slow, clunky experience. So when Pinterest converted their mobile website to a progressive web app, you can see the pluses across the board. I'm calling out a couple. User-generated ad revenue up 44%. And I think what's really interesting is, so the top row is how their PWA compared to their mobile website. The bottom line is how it compared to their native app. So incrementally better, and that's the vision, right, of sort of bringing that engagement in line with a native app experience. Tinder also sort of did the same thing. Similar reasons, hoping to improve engagement, and this is also a case study that you can find on Medium, but also were really cognizant of the fact that their native app, because it was so taxing and heavy, was providing a really bad experience, especially in regions where connections are slower, more encumbered. And so they saw the similar performance benefits, but also you can see the actual impact in the sort of the size of their Android app versus their PWA, and they saw a significant impact of this again, especially in areas where bandwidth is either costly or constrained. So now is the point where we bring the two together, AMP and PWA. So you can develop obviously with either one of those technologies separately, but there are, we see an increasing pattern of sites that are combining the two for an experience that really sort of supports, I'll kind of talk about this in a minute, this notion of a funnel where the user has a great experience with AMP and discovery and continues to have an engaging experience with the PWA. Oh, there it is, I forgot that was the next slide. So what I just said. So, the notion of kind of taking AMP at the top, wide mouth of the funnel, discoverability, and then being able to carry that optimization all the way through to retention. So I'll put this one back up at the end. This is made possible by an AMP component called AMP install service worker. So basically the user gets to the AMP page, the service worker is installed, and then the user is instantly upgraded to that PWA experience as they continue on with their engagement with the site. There are a lot of ways that you could implement this AMP and PWA combo. Here is our default recommended approach, but you know your site and your business best, and there are a lot of reasons why you might do this differently, but this will just kind of give you a framework, a model to think about how you might go about it. So there would be two steps: one, building your site with AMP, and then progressively enhancing that site with PWA. So in terms of building your site with AMP, you know, that may mean building your entire site with AMP, or it may mean focusing on the entry points to your site. So where do users usually land when they are referred into your site from elsewhere? So that could be article or leaf pages, ad landing pages, product listing pages. So prioritize those, since that's usually a user's first contact with your site. And then after that, progressively enhance with PWA. So that means service workers for basic caching, push notifications, build an app shell for navigation and page transitions, offline support, and then that AMP manifest for your add to home screen prompt. And so then if you sort of combine all of that, what you get, we say start fast, stay fast. So you get the fast loading AMP at the top, and then as the user continues to engage with the site, rich AMP features, as well as that PWA caching and offline access. So if, say, the connection drops, so the user is making a transaction, they don't lose their place in their journey. And then retention. So that's the web notifications and add home screen to keep the user coming back. Last case study, this is BMW, which followed this pattern. They converted their mobile experience from a standard mobile experience to a AMP PWA combo, and as a result saw 3 to 4 times faster load times, a 30% increase in click-through to their national sales company sites, which is their conversion goal, and then 26% more mobile users. That's kind of the story I wanted to tell. In terms of resources, I could have put 1 million links up on the slide, but instead just one each. So for AMP, it's ampproject.org. For PWA, a great resource is developers.google.com and then /web progressive web apps. You'll find it. Both of those, you will find technical documentation, case studies, videos, events. We do a lot of regional roadshows and developer events. Anything that you can think of, you should be able to find if you use these two as jumping off points. They're also, in preparation for this talk, I looked at some previous Drupal conference videos about these technologies, particularly about AMP, and there are some good ones out there that really talk about how to use the AMP module for Drupal. Yes, and here's an example of a video that actually talks about this combination of AMP and PWA. So again, in Drupal, just sort of being honest, we're sort of really just starting to learn how the Drupal platform works, and it's been a great experience so far. Google did collaborate with Lullabot in the accelerated mobile pages module. And I know that has been continuing to be updated. We're excited to see that one move forward. And then Chris will be doing a talk later this afternoon on progressive web apps. I'm sorry, tomorrow. Is the time right? Okay. Thank you. On the state of progressive web apps in Drupal. And so I kind of, sort of leave you as saying we're, very interested in your feedback, questions, suggestions, interested in understanding how Drupal sites are building with these technologies, what the barriers are. The more engaged we can be, the better we'll be. So that's, I think, all I had to say. And I think we have a few minutes for questions if anyone has questions. Anyone?